Okay, you're on tape now, so. Hi, so it's Mr. Cuffs today. We're letting the students pick, and Heather and Ella talked about the War of 1812 and the Treaty of Ghent that ends the War of 1812. And it is sort of an obscure war. So we fought the American Revolution, and let's just do a timeline here because I think that that'll help. So we fight the American Revolution 1775 to 1783, and this is the American Revolution. And then we're in a period here that we call the critical period because the Articles of Confederation stink. And we fought this war against Great Britain, remember? But we got help with the French and all sorts of other countries. So what ends up happening is the Articles are weak, they fail, and in 1789 we come up with our own constitutional government where we're going to elect a president and whatnot. As time marches on, we call this the early national years. In Washington, we're just giving you some context here. In Washington's president for the first 8, and he sets a lot of precedents. And one of them is that we steer clear of permanent alliances and avoid all these issues with Europe because he feels like we're a young country. European entanglements are really an infringement on us. What we see happen, however, is that in the 1790s, we fight like a quasi-war with France because they're disrespecting our freedom of sea. And then between 1800 to 1812, we have nothing but problems with Britain and France. Mostly Britain, but France too. And the problems are the impressment of our sailors. They don't respect us on the open sea. So the impressment of our sailors, which means taking our sailors and forcing them into labor and not respecting our trade, because they're fighting against each other in the Napoleonic Wars. So because of that, we're like a pawn in that game. So we try tactics like the Embargo Act, the Non-Intercourse Act, Macon's Bill No. 2, in efforts to be able to have freedom of the sea. We're also having issues with Great Britain with forts in the West. And we really aren't feeling comfortable with our relationship with Britain. And so when Madison is president after Jefferson in 1812, ushered by what are called war hawks, putting pressure from the West, the war hawks in Congress, Madison goes to war with Britain. War with Britain. And initially, the war is called to take land to Canada because Britain owns Canada. We want to clear Britain out of the continent. So there's this whole on to Canada mindset. Remember in class I used the analogy of a kid that was excited about beating another kid up and then the realization that, at the end he was happy he didn't get beaten up. And that's sort of what this war is. The War of 1812 is fought between 1812 and 1814, December of 1814. And in the war, we don't lose. We fought, it's the U.S. versus Great Britain, without much other help. And we don't lose. We get the White House burned, we lose a lot of battles. It's fought up in Canada and all the way down to New Orleans. It's fought on the sea. Our Navy stands toe-to-toe with the British Navy. The most significant battle, the Battle of New Orleans, takes place 2 weeks after the war ends. Because they didn't get message to New Orleans that, hey, the war's over, because there was no method of communication other than a long horseback journey. So now the point that we want to talk about. What happens with us in Britain after the war is a treaty called the Treaty of Ghent, which is a place in a country called Belgium, a neighbor of France. Every treaty's in France, except Britain hates France, so this treaty is in Ghent. It's in Belgium, the Treaty of Ghent. And so in this treaty, we were hoping people were coming, but they're not. the Treaty of Ghent. We got some fishing rights from Great Britain, and basically we didn't get Canada. We didn't really lose anything. The consequences of the treaty are more that we are a fully established nation, we'll never have issues with Great Britain again, and we're swelling with nationalism and pro-America stuff. We're feeling really pro-American. It also is the end of the Federalist Party, because the Federalists wanted the war to end, and they met in Hartford at a convention to try to bash the war, but the war already had ended, and it's the end of the Federalist Party. The Democrat-Republicans, we become almost a one-party system, and the Treaty of Ghent leads to all of this, and the era of good feelings, as it's called, in the teens, during Monroe's administration, who follows Madison. So that's in a nutshell the causes, the context of the War of 1812, an American war. The Star-Spangled Banner was written during this war, and then the end of the war, the treaty that really, we didn't win or lose anything, but we did get some recognition, and all the effects of the War of 1812. These are the effects of the War of 1812. That's good. Ella.
It's the end of the Federalists, right?
Yep, this is the end. They'll be gone forever as a political force. If they weren't already, when Hamilton died in 1804, it sort of was the end of the Federalists. What else? What is another area of anything that you want to talk about, particularly from 1607 to 1980?
1700s.
The 1700s? Okay. So this is period 2, the 1700s. And you know, one thing that could get asked, really two things. One thing is the 13 colonies and the characteristics of them. And then the other thing is the established American identity or culture. If we're talking period 2, unit 2 is 1607 to 1754. It's an area where Britain left us alone. Salutary neglect. How did they manage that? Through navigation acts. Through navigation acts, they left us alone through an economic policy called mercantilism. We existed to make Britain money because we were British. We're just British people living an ocean away. Okay? That's the relationship. And in that time frame, 13 colonies developed. And we often classify them into 3 regions. New England, the middle, and the southern colonies. And those 3 regions have specific climate and geography and characteristics. Okay? The New England colonies are Massachusetts, and then New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. The middle are Delaware, nobody cares, New Jersey, nobody cares, us here in New York, and Pennsylvania. The southern are Maryland, some call them middle, but they're a tobacco place. Virginia, the big one. North Carolina, South Carolina, and the last colony, the buffer and debtor haven of Georgia. Those are the regions. And obviously you know, this is short growing season, long growing season, long growing season. This is cold climate. This is cold-ish. And this is warm. Not tropical, but warm. And so what we see here is shipbuilding, and small farms, and fishing. We see large farms here, mostly family run. And we see plantations here with slaves. Okay? So those are some characteristics of that type of stuff. What type of people are in the South? Rich, white people, there's a few, then a whole bunch of poor whites and slaves from Africa. In New England, it's almost all English people. And religion is a centerpiece everywhere, but particularly with the Anglicans, the Church of England, the Congregationalists in New England, you know, the Puritans and whatnot. In the middle, it's more of a mix. You've got Dutch, Scotch-Irish, French Huguenots, Jewish, Swedes, and then obviously still the English are the dominant. So it's a lot more ethnically diverse in the middle, in part because the Quakers welcomed that, and a lot more religiously tolerant in a place like Pennsylvania. Education is different in the three regions. The biggest colonial cities are Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and Charleston, South Carolina. What do those four cities have in common? They all are on the ocean with great harbors and a way to move through water inland, like through river. So that's why those cities become big cities, because they become big places of trade. Why are New York, Boston, and Philadelphia big cities? Because they were trade cities in colonial America. Okay? These are the 13 counties. Now, what is the established English culture that emerges? Self-government. This is uniquely ours. English holidays and traditions and language. No hereditary aristocracy, which is a fancy way of saying no one's born into a title here. Does that make sense? No one's the Duke and the Duchess, the Lord and the Lordess. In America, we don't have that hereditary hierarchy. We're kind of our own unique, like, culture that's developed, which is more socioeconomically based. And, you know, in theory, we see through self-government, New England town hall meetings and the Virginia House of Burgesses. We see all this self-rule, and so we're not ruling through God and the state. We also see like freedom of the press and some of these basic freedoms established in colonial America, like the Zenger trial, which establishes something that will be a part of the First Amendment. So that's really the 17th century up to period 3, which is the steps of the American Revolution. Okay, one more thing. Let's take one more topic. Heather, Ella, Aiden, Caitlin, Liv, what?
Gilded Age.
You want to talk Gilded Age? Is that good? Do you guys want to do that? That's a tough one. So Gilded Age. Let's talk Gilded Age. Gilded Age is period 6. Okay, for those keeping score at home. What is period 6? Period 6 is 1860 to 1898. Period 6. And the Gilded Age is the politics of the age. A phrase coined by, of all people, the humorists of the time. So if Gilded Age is an essay topic, make sure you say, hey, Gilded Age was coined by Mark Twain. If it's the DBQ, you might get evidence beyond the document. If it's the LEQ, you might get part of the context point. All the little dumb things I say are spice for your ingredients for your essay. So Twain coins the phrase, and what it means is superficial glitter. And what that means is it's a lot of fake money. There's rich people like Rockefeller and Carnegie, but there's a lot of fake money and new money. There's a lot of glitter and pizzazz. But the Gilded Age really is ugly politics. Ugly stalemate politics. Ugly politics run by dirty, corrupt cities, and problems with the American Industrial Revolution, Boss Tweed and the Tweed Ring in New York City, and then national politics, politics of stalemate and patronage. What that means, stalemate, is nothing great actually gets accomplished. It's the era of forgettable presidents. You don't have to write them down, but Hayes, Garfield, assassinated, Arthur, Cleveland, Harrison, Cleveland. 20 years of forgettable presidents that were a part of stalemate politics that played the game of patronage, which means we really don't care about moving the country forward as much as we care about holding power and giving our friends jobs. The main issues of the Gilded Age were tariffs and silver versus gold, and the issues with farmers getting screwed over, and the beginning of unions. And the government through this whole period is a French word that means hands off, laissez-faire. Laissez-faire, I don't give a care. The government doesn't care. So groups like farmers and unions get screwed over. And the poor people that want more silver so that there's more money in circulation get screwed over as well. And that don't want tariffs because they're consumers, they get screwed. So what ends up happening, because they don't feel like the two-party system is responsive, is what happens in the Gilded Age is a third party emerges called the Populist Party in the 1890s. And I played you that analogy with the Wizard of Oz. And we showed the Cross of Gold speech and talked about William Jennings Bryan. And even though he didn't win, he exposed all of the whole gold standard favoring rich people. And a lot of the stuff that the populists wanted in the 1890s, they didn't get, but the progressives got it a generation later in the early 1900s. So a lot of the populist agenda, and what were the populists? Poor factory workers and farmers merging together. It was a movement. Factory workers and farmers, it was a movement. And that's the Gilded Age in a nutshell. It's nothing too exciting. Forgettable presidents, like I said, from 1876 to 1896. Hayes, Garfield, Arthur, Cleveland, Harrison, and Cleveland. And McKinley kind of takes us out of that. So thank you for joining me. Those are 3 good topics. Bye. Oops, weird angle.